So today we are going to talk about makeup for opera versus makeup for a more traditional, like smaller theatrical space. So we're going to focus on old age makeup. I just felt like that was probably like the easiest way for me to kind of show you all like the contrast between what more of like a traditional like old age makeup might look like for like a smaller theatrical space versus the one that we are going to do for this demo. That would be something that would be much more appropriate for a larger theatrical space and also for the genre of opera. So on this slide I already went through and I did just like a very like light old age makeup. I used cream makeup for everything. Sometimes though for lighter theatrical makeup I actually do prefer to use powders. I personally have really oily skin, so for me I can only put so much cream on my face before the oil kind of starts to break through it. So I do actually prefer to do as much work as I usually can with powders, but for this, all I did was use cream makeup and then I set my face with powder. So the main difference that you're really going to see between theatrical old age makeup for a smaller stage and for a larger stage or for the opera is just honestly like the amount of blending that you're going to do. So on this side of my face, though it still does look pretty prominent, you have to remember I'm pretty close right now compared to be like if I was on a stage, this would be pretty subtle from stage. So everything is pretty blended out. It's really mostly blended into just like the shadows and highlights kind of just like blurring together. There's not necessarily any strongly defined lines on my face. But for the operatic side, which we saw in all the research that we did for this, you generally see things where the lines are a lot bolder and there's almost more of like a strong like ombre effect going on the face, as opposed to a traditional like old age makeup where it's could be a little bit more blended if you don't have to have the makeup read from quite as far away. So just really quick to review before we get into this. So for old age makeup, I always like to start by putting on a foundation. So on this side of my face, I just have on cream foundation. I did not set this half. I have set this side of my face, but I did not set the other half. So you want to make sure that if you're going to use all creams or all liquids or whatever it is, you don't want to set anything that you will need to put something else like liquidy or creamy on top of. So if I like put on my cream foundation and then I set it and then I try to blend other creams on top of it, it's just going to start to get kind of like cakey and it's just not going to blend at all for you. So you want to make sure that you put all of your creams down and then you set it once you're happy with like your blending, just because there's only so much you can do to alter it once you have set everything. And as far as like the colors to choose, me personally, I don't like to pale people out for old age makeup. I think you end up putting so much highlight on the face a lot of times that people end up a little bit paler. So I still usually choose a foundation that is as close to the person's natural skin tone as possible. Not everybody does it that way, but that is just the way that I found that I prefer to do it. And I also think that it is like the most universal way to be able to just like work on all different kinds of people. So you may have been taught differently than that other places, but for me, I just find by the time I'm done blending out the highlight and the shadows, there's really no need to make anyone paler because you have the contrast that you need. And then as far as like picking what types of colors to use for the highlights and shadows, I usually tell people if they're not sure where to start, because typically in like theatrical classes you usually like learn your corrective makeup first. I usually tell people to start with whatever their highlight and shadow shades are from their corrective makeup and then kind of go from there. So if whatever your contour shade is not strong enough to kind of show up, because like this color I was like had to put like a little bit of like purple in it and I did have to deepen it a little bit compared to what I typically use to like contour myself, but it gave me a place to start. So if you at least have somewhere to start, that's going to make it seem like a lot less overwhelming, I think, because I think a lot of times when we have to do makeups like this, we just have no idea like what shades or colors at all to use. So I usually tell people to start with that highlight and shadow shade that they already know works for them, already looks good on them, and just kind of adjust it from there. So for like a more operatic makeup style for old age, you're probably going to have to change those a little bit. Obviously, you can only make your highlight so light. So for me, like on this side, I already had to use white as my highlight, so it's not going to get any lighter than that. But I did have to deepen shadows already, so definitely on my operatic side, I'm going to have to deepen it a little bit more than what I would do for something that needs to look like a little bit more subtle. And that's something too that you just have to keep in mind, is that this is technically like a different style of makeup, or if you are doing makeup just for like a larger theatrical house in general, it's technically has to be done in like a different way than what you might be used to doing. And that's probably more like, again, like when you're getting into the operas like this, or if you're working in like a really large like outdoor theater or something, you just have to do a little bit more and give the makeup a little bit more contrast so that it actually shows up at that greater distance. Um, and then what I found, so like what I kind of quickly mentioned over here, was adding like purples and reds into makeup. I feel like that helps a lot with old age makeup, like especially around the eyes, because I think a lot of times we end up with these just like very, very like flat brown tones, and around our eyes, I don't always think that makes the most sense, because a lot of times we're kind of like enhancing like under eye circles that might already be there. So it's kind of nice to have that sort of like purpley tone. And then sometimes the red just sort of like helps break up some of the other colors. Like if something gets like a little bit like too pale in some places, I think like stippling a little bit of red or purple can kind of help like put a little bit of color back into the face, or it can just kind of show sort of like a general like skin irritation or just like skin redness, which usually helps with these types of character makeups to just give it like a little bit more like personality. I've also found too that a lot of times I think for old age makeup, the colors get like very generalized, and people just use like these very, very like red brown shades when like really they should be using something that's like a little bit cooler because they're trying to create shadows. And then a lot of times people just use like pure white when a lot of people actually need something with like a slightly yellow tint or like a slightly like creamy tint. So really I do urge you to kind of like play around with colors and figure out what actually looks best like on you or the person that you're working on, because a lot of times like we do get these really great like general like old age stipple colors and like cream shadow that's like character shadow or things like that in our kits, and they work great for some people, but they're not going to be perfect for everybody. So it's important to kind of like know how to adjust that for who you're working on, and to always like spend the time trying to figure that out. So one way that I like to do that, so I like to either work with like palettes or with like wheels that have multiple colors in it. So a lot of like the theatrical brands like Krylon and Ben Nye, like they do make really great wheels and palettes, but really you don't even have to have like specific colors that say they're like for theatrical makeup or old age. Like it can be like foundations, it can be eyeshadows if you want to use powder. I don't really think that you're limited as long as you're choosing things that like flatter the skin and look realistic, and that it's giving you like the contrast and the amount of coverage that you are needing for it to show up on stage. So I'm going to mostly focus, as you can kind of tell on this side, I'm going to mostly focus on the eye area for this, but I will do like a little bit of shading like around the mouth and cheeks and a little on the forehead, but I am going to focus mostly on the eye, just because I think a lot of times like we've seen with other things, like the eyes are where a lot of our like most dramatic makeup takes place, like whether it's like focusing on like a beautiful eye makeup, or it's like a bruised eye, or it's like a really aged eye or something. I think that because so much of our like expression and emotion comes from our eyes, they kind of placing more of an emphasis on that ends up becoming really important in theatrical makeup. So the very first thing that I'm going to do, I like to draw in all my shadows first. Me personally, I see shadows more easily than I do highlights. So for me, I always like to start with my shadows. I place all my lines and then I go back in and I blend things. I found that if I try to blend my highlights and shadows at the exact same time, that things get really muddy. And I have a hard time kind of controlling like where the color is going. But that's me, and that's how I work personally. So if that is not what you find happens when you like mix things at the same time, or when you're working, you don't have to do it this way. And I think that a lot of times when we are learning things in like our makeup classes, we're very used to being told like this is the way that you have to do it, and then you start to think like this is the only way that it's going to work. But I always like tell people that it's more important to figure out the way that like works for you, or like works for your actor. And like, you know, like I don't like to apply makeup with my hands. I don't use my hands on other people, but if I'm like working with an actor and they're the ones that are actually going to be doing this makeup and I'm just teaching it to them and they want to put it on with their hands and that's the way that they're comfortable, then I let them do it, because ultimately you want whoever is wearing this makeup to like feel confident in it and feel comfortable in it, and whatever way gets it on their face is probably the way that you need to just let them do it. So that's one thing I feel like I've kind of like learned to let go of too, is that just like your way is not always the perfect way of doing things. So you do kind of have to accept that when you kind of step into like the makeup design world a little bit. But yeah, so I'm going to start putting in some shadows. And then I always say just apply it however. It's really about how you blend things. So even though we're going to have a lot of contrast, the way that we blend it is going to be a little bit different than the way that I blended things out on this side. When I work like this, I personally like to use like a really, really like teeny tiny thin brush that you can like hardly see. Just because I feel like it's a little bit easier for me to like draw in lines that way. But again, there's some people who like to use their hands. You can use sponges. Sometimes like I'll like rip the little makeup sponges and I'll just use like the pointier end of it. But personally for this kind of work, I found that like a really thin brush, and like really this is like a $3 brush. So it's not like it has to be anything expensive. But I find I have more success with something that's like a little bit thinner. And so for this, I already have some colors mixed up from what I used on the other side of my face. So we're going to see if those are strong enough. Otherwise, I might have to mix up a couple other colors. So just to kind of start, we're going to go in and then, so I don't know why, but no matter what I'm doing, if I'm not focusing on the eyes, I prefer to always start on the eyes when it comes to this kind of makeup. I don't know why. I think it's just because it's like a central point for me to focus on. But again, if that's not what you want to do, you don't have to start there. I feel like it just gives me a place to start. And it's just kind of like a habit that I've formed. So again, so this is that same kind of like purpley color, but it's not going to be quite as like blended out as I blended on this side. So I usually tell people when they're doing old age makeup, you know, I want everybody to put foundation on, but I don't usually have them if they like to like color correct under their eyes or like things like that. I usually don't have them do it just because often we're just like bringing that back. Because I usually like to think of old age makeup and I kind of teach it as like the opposite of what you learn in your corrective makeup. So I don't always have people spend the time going in and kind of like correcting all these things if I'm just gonna go back and like bring out exactly what they covered. So I don't personally think more than putting on foundation that you need to do heavy concealing or anything like that. But again, that's like a personal preference. So I'm gonna go in and I like to kind of like give a lot of eye bags to people and a lot of definition. So since this is like a little bit purpley, I'm gonna go like right under my eye, and this is like a cream makeup that I can use everywhere, so I'm not nervous about it being close to the eye. I'm not gonna put it like on my waterline or anything, but I'm not afraid of like blending it super close to my eye. So I have that in there, and what I usually like to do, like even if I know like I want to extend this out more, I don't extend it out as far as I plan on like blending it out, because I think that's how we end up with like a lot of like the crazy harsh lines that I think like theatrical makeup gets like a really bad reputation for having. So I usually like will pick like a stopping point, usually about halfway, and then I will blend out the rest of it kind of like as I see fit. And then usually like right in this area, we want this to get pretty dark on most people, and I usually kind of like cut into it, because usually if you think about it, like if you're doing your corrective makeup, you're really going to want to like brighten this on most people. So even though we're going to still need some kind of like a highlight to show contrast, we're going to really want to go in and kind of like shade that, kind of do like that opposite like sinking in effect instead of having it like pop out more, like we like to do with makeup a lot. And then you can kind of do the same thing on this side to kind of like dramatically like help that part of the eye like droop down a little bit. And again, it's all gonna look a little weird when it's just like lines, but I just think it's a lot easier to just get everything on and then worry about like blending it, just because you'll spend so much time like putting on this line and then blending it, but then you're just gonna have to go back and do it again usually. So I think it's easier to just kind of like get everything on and then worry about it after the fact. And then we'll do some crow's feet. A lot of people like to use like eyeliners for this part of the makeup. I think that's totally fine. Just make sure if it is, I think a pencil is a little bit better than like a liquid. Gels are fine, just make sure you let them dry before you do too much like movement or anything around the eye. And then just make sure that the pencils are soft enough, because there's definitely some I think that come in like the theatrical kits that are not that soft, and they can kind of hurt when they are around people's eyes. And then a lot of times with eye bags, I like to give people a lot of eye bags. So I'll do like, I like to do it where like I'll have one that kind of like comes up here, and then I'll have another one that comes on that side, just to help it get a little bit more dramatic. And I think it's more fun, because honestly, if you're already making people, like if it has to be like a really dramatic age makeup, if they're already gonna look old, you might as well like have fun with it, and have a little bit of like personality with it too, I think even. So a lot of times, as long as they kind of like go over each other, you'll be able to go in and really like highlight that, and that'll end up looking really puffy, and it'll be a fun eye bag, as I usually say in my classes. And then I'm gonna go in and do a little bit of shading. So again, this is just me like placing the lines, and then I'm gonna worry about blending afterwards. So this looks like super pink the way it's on, but it's a little bit more brown in not video life, but if I end up having to deepen it, I will definitely do that. Okay, and so that's gonna end up being like blended, and then usually you end up with a little bit going on right here. So obviously, so this is my own face, and I just did this side, so I kind of know where I want to place wrinkles. But if you have never done this before, or you're not sure like how to start on another person, if you just have people kind of like move their faces around, you can usually figure out where things need to go. So you can like squint your eyes, you can like raise up your forehead, and so I can see where some of my like natural forehead wrinkles are. I don't necessarily like to do ones where it's like super straight lines. I know that like that's how some people's faces are, but I just feel like when people are at rest on stage, it looks a little bit strange. So I don't personally like to do that, but some people do. And then for now, we're just gonna kind of like hollow this out. And then this is one thing that I see a lot of people kind of go wrong with. They like bring this line down really, really far, and then it's just like this giant straight line. And you're gonna see like we're gonna have to really like go back in and define it. But I, again, like I did with the eye bags, I like to stop it and then I'll blend it down to kind of help it like make that shape without having to have such like a horribly like dramatic line there. And then we can go ahead and we'll fill this in, and I'm gonna do it kind of like at a slightly different shape than I did on the other side. And then for the side, so the side is a little tricky when you're working on yourself, but a lot of times I like to do the kind of thing where you draw in jowls, like we talked about in class before, which is just sort of like little like crisscrosses. And again, doing this on yourself at this angle, that's a little tricky, but this, when you like highlight it and shade it correctly, is like a super effective way to do stage makeup. So I always like to show people that, and then I usually will throw a little bit of shading under this, but this usually takes a second to kind of figure out like what the right balance of shading is. So I know I'm going to want to go back and do that. We'll go ahead and just add a line to my chin. It's a little weird when you're doing the like half and half, but at least to show y'all. And again, so when you usually like highlight this for like beauty makeup, so I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna end up making that darker. For the nose, even if I'm not like doing anything to change the shape of it, I don't want it to just be like out of place, so I'll usually just do like a more intense contour than what I would normally do, just so that way it's not like super flat, and then you'll see like I'll just like blend it down. And then you don't want to forget, like, I see a lot of people do this where they like have all these great wrinkles and stuff, but then there's just like this one patch of like perfect forehead. So don't forget about that part. But yeah, so very basically, this is kind of where I know I want all my shadows to be. So I'm going to go in and do just a couple more, kind of like finesse things a little bit, and then we're going to talk about how we are going to blend them.